John stood there tapping his foot, his expensive leather shoes squeaking on the supermarket tiles like a trapped rodent. He looked at Robert, an old man whose card had just been declined, with the kind of pity that is actually just poorly disguised contempt. My son-in-law thinks he is fast because he talks a lot, but he does not realize that being loud is just another way of being transparent. I stepped forward, my movements deliberate and heavy with the weight of 60 years of knowing better, and placed my card on the reader. On me, I said, not because I am a saint, but because I know what it is like to have the world try to trim your dignity. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing. But for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories. Robert did not offer a shaky thank you. He looked at me with eyes that had seen things John could not even imagine in his worst nightmares. He leaned in, his grip on my arm as firm as a vice, reminding me that age does not always mean a loss of strength. Tomorrow, before noon, stay away from your garage, he whispered, his voice as sharp as a razor blade hidden in velvet. No matter what you hear, no matter who calls, do not open those doors until the sun is directly overhead. John chuckled behind me, a shallow sound from a shallow man, and made a comment about senile ramblings. I did not answer him, because answering a fool is just a waste of breath I would rather save for more important matters. Mary caught my eye from the next aisle. She did not need to hear the words to know that the atmosphere in the room had shifted. We walked to the car in a silence that I let grow until it felt like a physical pressure against John's constant chatter. I have lived long enough to know that when a man with nothing left to lose gives you a warning, you listen with both ears. The weight of that warning sat in my mind all night, heavier than the keys to the garage I was now forbidden to enter. Tomorrow would either prove me a fool or show me exactly what my family had been hiding behind my back. The sun crawled across the kitchen floor like a slow-moving intruder, mocking the stillness I had forced upon myself. Usually, by 8 a.m., I am in my garage, surrounded by the honest scent of sawdust and oil, but today I was a prisoner in my own living room. I tried to occupy my hands by fixing the loose hinge on the pantry door, but without my proper tools, I was about as effective as a cat trying to play a piano. Mary watched me fumble with a butter knife, her silence a loud reminder that I was acting like a man who had forgotten how to sit still. If you keep staring at that door, James, it's going to develop an insecurity complex, she remarked, her dry wit cutting through my restlessness. I managed to drop the screw twice, watching it roll under the fridge with a spiteful little clatter that felt like a personal insult from the universe. It's funny how a man who once managed a crew of 50 can be defeated by a 3mm piece of hardware and a lack of floor space. I gave up on the hinge and sat by the window, my eyes drifting toward the driveway where my garage sat like a sealed tomb. John pulled up in his shiny SUV, parking at an angle that screamed he hadn't mastered basic geometry, and stepped out looking far too energetic for a Sunday morning. He didn't knock, he just walked in, asking if he could borrow my industrial power drill for a quick project he'd probably ruin within 10 minutes. I told him the garage was off limits today, and the way his face twitched told me my refusal wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a disruption of a plan. He didn't push back, which was unusual for a man who loves the sound of his own voice, and that lack of persistence set off a silent alarm in my head. He lingered by the window, his eyes darting toward the very doors Robert had warned me to stay away from. Anxiety isn't a flutter in the heart for a man my age. It's a cold, calculated awareness that the chess pieces are moving while I'm still deciding on my first turn. I caught John checking his phone and glancing at the garage lock, his thumb hovering over the screen with a strange, nervous urgency. The clock ticked toward 10, and the air in the house began to feel thin, as if the walls were slowly closing in on a secret I wasn't supposed to find. Patricia arrived at 11, carrying a stack of organizational bins that looked like plastic coffins for my memories. She swept through the kitchen with the brisk, uninvited energy of a realtor evaluating a property that was already sold in her head. I sat at the table, nursing a cold cup of coffee and trying to ignore the smoke detector in the hallway that had started its rhythmic, high-pitched chirp for a battery change. Of course, the spare batteries and the stepladder were locked in the garage, a territory currently under a self-imposed embargo. I've survived 3 recessions and a corporate takeover. Yet I was being taunted by a 90-cent piece of circuitry I couldn't reach without breaking a promise to a stranger. Dad, we really need to talk about the clutter in there, Patricia said, gesturing toward the backyard while tossing a sugar-free protein bar onto the counter. I've noticed that people who eat things that taste like flavored drywall usually have the most aggressive opinions on how others should spend their time. She didn't ask if I wanted help. She informed me that Michael would be arriving shortly with a truck to clear the path for some new storage ideas. It is a special kind of injustice when your children start talking about your life in the past tense while you are still sitting right in front of them. I offered a dry smile, the kind that masks a gathering storm, and told her that my clutter had a better sense of purpose than her husband's career. She didn't laugh, because humor requires a level of self-awareness that she had clearly traded for a corporate title years ago. I watched her glance at her watch, her eyes flicking toward the garage with the same predatory hunger I'd seen in John earlier that morning. They weren't just being helpful. They were acting like scavengers circling a site they thought was abandoned. They think my age has turned my vision blurry, but it has only made the patterns of their greed much sharper. A sudden, heavy metallic thud echoed from the driveway, followed by the sound of Michael's truck doors slamming with unnecessary force. I saw the three of them exchange a quick, sharp look through the window, a silent signal that the cleanup was starting ahead of schedule. Michael stood by his truck, looking at the garage as if it were a project he'd already conquered on paper. I watched him through the blinds, feeling the familiar weight of a man who knows a storm is coming but hasn't yet decided whether to open the umbrella or just let the rain wash away the dust. In the kitchen, I tried to reclaim some dignity by making a sandwich, but the bread was that high-fiber, sprouted grain nonsense Mary buys that tastes like a compressed bird's nest. I accidentally squirted mustard onto my favorite world's best grandpa shirt, a gift from my granddaughter that I only wear to remind myself that irony is the best defense against reality. I tried to wipe it off, but only succeeded in making it look like a yellow Rorschach test of my own frustration. James, the boys are getting restless out there, Mary said, her voice a calm anchor in a sea of rising static. Restless is a polite word for what was happening. Michael was already rattling the side door handle, his jaw set in that stubborn line he inherited from my father. I walked onto the porch, the mustard stain a small badge of my humanity, and leaned against the railing with a stillness that usually makes people nervous. The lock is a bit temperamental, Michael, just like its owner, I called out, my voice carrying just enough edge to stop him mid-stride. He looked up, startled, as if he'd forgotten I still owned the air he was breathing on my property. We just want to get a head start, Dad, before the heat picks up, he replied, his tone dripping with that condescending efficiency young people use to mask their impatience. Patricia was already hovering behind him, looking like she was ready to inventory my soul and sell it for scrap. I've spent decades building walls that keep people out, and now my own blood was trying to dismantle them while I was still standing on the battlements. I checked my watch. It was 11:42, 18 minutes of silence standing between me and whatever truth Robert had promised. John joined them, carrying a set of bolt cutters he'd clearly bought on the way over, his lack of respect finally graduating from verbal jabs to physical intent. I didn't move, I didn't shout. I just watched them circle my life's work like wolves who had forgotten the alpha still had his teeth. Michael reached for the padlock with the cutters, his eyes meeting mine in a challenge that felt like a betrayal of 40 years of fatherhood. Then, a muffled, rhythmic thumping started from behind the heavy oak doors, sounding like a frantic heartbeat against the wood. A single fly was circling my head with the annoying persistence of a debt collector, and I found myself tracking its erratic flight with a focus that would have impressed a fighter pilot. I made a calculated swipe, missed by a fraction, and nearly sent my world's best grandpa mug tumbling to its ceramic death. A minor humiliation that I handled with more grace than Michael's clumsy attempt at authority. My son stood there with those bolt cutters, looking like a man who thought he could cut through 40 years of my life as easily as a piece of hardened steel. Dad, don't make this difficult. We just want to clear out the junk before you hurt yourself, he said, using that soft, patronizing voice people use for toddlers or the dying. It's a bitter irony to spend a lifetime teaching your children how to walk, only to have them try to walk all over you the moment they think your pace has slowed. John was nodding along, his smirk suggesting he'd already appraised my tool collection for his own garage. Patricia didn't even look up from her tablet, probably calculating the square footage of the space she was about to repurpose. I didn't raise my voice. I simply leaned back into the shadows of the porch, letting the weight of my silence do the heavy lifting. I've seen men more dangerous than these three crumble under the pressure of a quiet room, and I was in no hurry to break the spell. The thumping from behind the garage doors grew more frantic, a dull, rhythmic pounding that rattled the very foundation of the driveway. Michael's bravado wavered for a second, his eyes flicking toward the noise, but his greed was currently louder than his common sense. 5 minutes, Michael, I said, checking my watch with a steady hand that didn't show a hint of the storm brewing inside me. If you touch that lock before noon, you'll be finding out exactly why your mother and I never moved to a smaller house. He sneered, a pathetic attempt to regain his footing, and stepped closer to the door just as the church bells began to chime in the distance. A sharp, metallic snap echoed through the air, not from the bolt cutters, but from the internal mechanism of the garage lock, as if it were being turned by an invisible hand. Then, the first drop of something dark and viscous leaked from the bottom of the door, staining Michael's white shoes with a permanence he wasn't prepared for. I've spent my life building structures meant to last, believing the foundation's strength would protect the inhabitants. You don't realize until the sun starts to set that the greatest threat isn't the weather, but the impatience of those you invited to live under your roof. Control isn't just about holding the wheel. It's about knowing exactly when to let the weight of someone else's mistake do the teaching. Michael stared at the dark stain on his white sneakers, his face twisting into a mask of disgust that looked remarkably like his mother's when she finds a moth in the pantry. I reached for my phone, intending to check the internal sensors, but my thumbs, blunt instruments forged by decades of manual labor, stubbornly opened the calculator instead. I stood there staring at a string of zeros while my son prepared to destroy my privacy, a brief moment of modern absurdity that I met with a thin, sarcastic smile. If you're looking for a refund on those shoes, Michael, the oil usually charges a premium for the patina, I remarked, my voice steady despite the cold fire in my chest. Patricia was already pacing the lawn, her voice a sharp staccato as she discussed estate logistics with someone on her headset. It is a profound, quiet tragedy to watch your own blood transform into scavengers, their eyes darting over your property like they're already tagging items for an auction. I felt the last lingering warmth of fatherly patience extinguish, replaced by a cold, calculated clarity that I usually reserved for boardroom battles. They think my silence is a sign of fading relevance, but it is actually the sound of me deciding which bridge to burn first. Michael ignored my warning and braced the bolt cutters against the padlock, his jaw set in a line of misplaced heroic intent. I didn't stop him this time. I simply stepped back and watched the clock on the porch wall tick toward the final second of my grace. The air around the garage seemed to thicken, smelling suddenly of old wood and something far more metallic and ancient than engine oil. A heavy, rhythmic thudding started from the other side of the door, accompanied by a sound that made Michael's hands freeze mid-clench. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of a heavy bolt being drawn back from the inside, followed by a low, vibrating hum that made the ground beneath our feet tremble. The final chime of the noon bell echoed across the yard, sharp and final as a gavel hitting a block. Michael didn't even wait for the vibration to fade. He lunged at the lock with the bolt cutters, his face flushed with the fever of a man who thinks he's finally won. I stood there, my hands clasped behind my back, feeling a quiet, arctic fury crystallize in my marrow. My digital watch began to beep, a reminder I'd set months ago for a task I'd already finished, and I found myself squinting at the tiny buttons with a look of profound betrayal. There I was, facing a family coup, while my wrist chirped with the persistent, mindless optimism of a gadget I clearly hadn't mastered. It is a peculiar kind of comedy to be a man of granite whose only weakness is a 3-button interface designed by a teenager in a basement. I've spent decades ensuring my children never had to feel the cold, yet here they were, trying to push me out into it before I'd even finished my morning coffee. "Stop," I said, a single syllable that held the concentrated weight of every sacrifice I had ever made for this family. They didn't listen. They never do when they think there is a profit to be calculated or a burden to be efficiently managed. I saw Patricia shift the for sale sign she thought she'd hidden behind her back, her eyes already scanning the property for potential curb appeal. My fury wasn't a fire that burned, it was a frost that preserved, allowing me to see every detail of their greed with agonizing, surgical clarity. I realized then that I hadn't been protecting the garage from them. I had been protecting them from the realization of how little they actually knew about me. Michael grunted, the cutters snapping through the steel, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. I turned my head slightly, catching Mary's gaze through the kitchen window, and I saw that her grace had finally reached its expiration date as well. The heavy garage door didn't just open. It groaned as it began to rise under its own power, as if a hidden mechanism had been triggered by the chime. The smell that hit us wasn't oil or sawdust. It was the rich, heavy scent of expensive tobacco and the sharp, ozone tang of high-end server fans. As the light flooded the interior, Michael dropped the cutters, his knees buckling as he saw the rows of glowing screens and the figure sitting in my old workbench chair.
I watched them from the porch, my arms crossed, feeling a cold satisfaction at the sight of Michael's ruined sneakers. It's funny, I spent 20 years teaching that boy how to tie his laces, and he still hasn't learned where not to step. I smoothed my apron, realizing I still had a smudge of flour on my cheek from the scones I'd baked for a family that clearly didn't deserve my labor. James stood like a statue, his back straight, while our children vibrated with the frantic energy of people who realize they've walked into a trap of their own making. I walked down the steps, my movements fluid and precise, not wasting an ounce of energy on unnecessary drama. Patricia's for sale sign was clutched in her hand like a broken shield, her face turning a fascinating shade of pale. I've noticed that when greed meets reality, the first thing to go is the ability to maintain a polite expression. They think our silence is a sign of confusion, but we are simply waiting for the noise of their stupidity to subside. I stood beside James, noticing the mustard stain on his shirt. Even in the middle of a family betrayal, he manages to keep his sense of humor in the laundry pile. We looked into the garage together, seeing not the junk they expected, but a sophisticated command center that made John's office look like a kindergarten playroom. Robert, the man from the supermarket, wasn't just sitting there, he was monitoring data streams that bore our family name. The children's plans for our future were laid out on the screens, dissected and analyzed like a bad business proposal. They wanted to take our house, but they didn't realize we had already taken their leverage. I saw Michael try to speak, but his voice died in his throat when he saw his own signature on the screen, highlighted in red. It isn't just a garage anymore. It's the place where their secrets have finally come to be archived. The man in the chair turned slowly, his eyes locking onto John, who was suddenly trembling with more than just surprise. A file folder was slid across the desk, labeled with a date that made the air in the driveway feel dangerously thin. I stepped into the cool, climate-controlled air of the garage, leaving the humid disappointment of the driveway behind. Robert looked up from a monitor, his expression as flat as a desert horizon, and tapped a key that sent a cascade of documents across the wall-sized display. Patricia gasped, her tablet slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the epoxy floor, a sound that was much more satisfying than her constant lecturing. It turns out my children weren't just trying to simplify our lives, they had been treating our retirement fund like an interest-free ATM for years. James was standing next to a rack of servers, trying to look like he understood the coding on the screen, though I know for a fact he still calls the television remote the clicker. He once spent an hour trying to program the toaster, yet here he was, presiding over a digital fortress that had caught our own blood in a net of their own making. John's face was the color of a bruised plum as his private offshore accounts were highlighted in a neon green that was frankly quite garish. We were going to pay it back, Michael stammered, his bravado now nothing more than a puddle on the floor next to his oil-stained shoes. I've spent 40 years folding their laundry and wiping their tears, never realizing I was also subsidizing their failures and their lies. The new facts weren't just numbers. They were a roadmap of every time they had looked us in the eye and calculated how much we were worth as an asset rather than as parents. I felt a strange, cold clarity, the kind that comes when you finally realize the people you raised have become strangers you need to defend yourself against. Robert pulled up a final document, a power of attorney form that had been forged with a signature that looked suspiciously like a clumsy imitation of James's handwriting. I didn't scream or cry. I simply adjusted my glasses and looked at my daughter until she finally had the decency to turn her head away. Patricia reached for the terminal, her panic finally overriding her common sense, but the screen flashed a warning that froze her in place. There was one more folder, encrypted and glowing, titled with today's date and the names of the lawyers who were already waiting for our signal. I watched the cursor blink on the wall like a heart monitor for our family's integrity, its rhythmic pulse the only thing filling the sudden silence. John looked like he was about to vomit on my freshly swept floor, which was honestly the only thing I felt like protecting at that moment. James tried to lean casually against a sleek server rack to look intimidating, but he miscalculated the edge and his elbow slipped, sending a tray of metal stylus pens clattering across the room. He recovered with a sharp, dry cough, pretending the noise was a strategic distraction, though I saw him whisper a curse about frictionless modern junk under his breath. It is the enduring comedy of my life that I am married to a man who can bridge a chasm, but is consistently defeated by a smooth countertop. Patricia started to back away toward the driveway, her eyes darting like a trapped bird's, but Robert tapped a single key and the heavy security shutters began to descend with a low, industrial hum. The sound was final, a mechanical note that cut off the sunlight and left our children standing in the cold, blue glow of the truth. "The turn," Robert said quietly, looking at me for the signal we had rehearsed in the quiet hours of the night. I leaned forward, the light from the monitors reflecting in my glasses, and revealed the one detail they had overlooked in their greed. We weren't just the targets of Michael's embezzlement. James and I were the anonymous majority shareholders of the very firm he had been trying to loot. The look on my son's face when his own company's board of directors list appeared with our names at the top was worth every burnt scone and ignored phone call of the last decade. They thought they were the predators in this house, but they were merely guests who had overstayed their welcome in a lair they didn't understand. I felt a fleeting pang of motherly grief, but it was quickly replaced by the cold, bracing necessity of a woman protecting her territory. Michael reached for his phone to call his lawyer, but the signal bars vanished as the garage's internal jammer hummed into life. He looked at the device as if it had betrayed him, finally realizing that the cage doors hadn't just closed, they had been locked from the inside months ago. I stepped closer to Michael, the blue light of the monitors making his face look like a distorted mask of the child I once nurtured. John was frantically trying to straighten his tie, but his fingers were fumbling so badly he looked like he was slowly strangling himself with his own expensive silk. James decided this was the moment to take a commanding seat, but the high-tech ergonomic stool Robert had provided was a bit too eager, spinning him a full 360 before he could find his balance. He caught himself with a sharp grunt, his eyes narrowing as if the stool's lack of professional decorum was a personal insult from the manufacturer. "This thing has more moving parts than my first truck and half the common sense," he muttered, finally planting his heavy boots on the floor to kill the momentum. Patricia finally found her voice, but it was high-pitched and brittle, a jagged contrast to the cold, corporate tone she'd used to discuss our relocation. "You can't just lock the doors, Mom. This is kidnapping or something equally ridiculous," she cried, her eyes darting toward the steel shutters. I let a small, dry laugh escape my lips, the kind of sound that cuts through a room like a winter wind through a screen door. "Kidnapping is such a dramatic word for a family meeting you were so desperate to start without us," I replied, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "I've spent decades softening the world for them, only to realize I was just giving them better tools to try and bury us." Michael tried to lunge toward the main terminal, his desperation finally overriding what little logic he had left. James didn't even have to stand up. He simply raised a single, calloused hand, a silent command that stopped my son mid-stride like a brick wall. The confrontation wasn't about shouting, it was the heavy, suffocating pressure of three people realizing they were trapped with the only two people they could never outsmart. I looked at Patricia and saw not my daughter, but a predator who had forgotten that the oldest wolves in the pack are the ones who survived the hardest winters. John finally stopped his frantic fidgeting, his face turning a ghostly white as he looked at the screens, displaying the ruins of his secret life. We didn't need to break them. We just had to let the weight of their own choices finish the job they had started. Michael's eyes drifted toward a heavy iron mallet on the edge of the workbench, his hand twitching with a dangerous, cornered animal reflex. James's hand slid quietly under the desk, his fingers finding the familiar, cold grip of the emergency bypass switch. I saw Michael's fingers brush the heavy handle of the mallet, a primitive response to a sophisticated defeat. It is a strange, hollow feeling to realize that the boy I once taught to build birdhouses would even consider using a tool to strike out at the man who gave him everything. James sat there, his face an unreadable mask of granite, while he absent-mindedly tried to tap a reheat button on a high-tech thermal mug that was clearly smarter than his current level of patience. He missed the touch-sensitive pad twice, his thick, calloused finger accidentally triggering the party mode instead, causing the mug to pulse a frantic, neon-pink light in the middle of our cold standoff. He let out a dry, weary sigh, as if the mug's misplaced celebration was the final, most irritating betrayal of the day. "I'll never understand why a cup of coffee needs a light show to stay warm," he grumbled, his voice low and dangerous, his eyes never leaving Michael's hand. The real threat wasn't the hammer, it was the quiet, final snapping of the invisible threads that had held this family together for 40 years. Patricia was making a dry, gasping sound, the noise people make when they realize their safety net has turned into a noose they tied themselves. I felt a mourning not for them, but for the memory of the children they used to be before they started measuring our lives in square footage and inheritance taxes. John was whispering to himself, a frantic inventory of his shattered lies, looking like a man who had forgotten how to breathe without a prepared script. I leaned against the workbench, the cold metal biting into my palms, a grounding reminder that reality is often less comfortable than the illusions we maintain for our children. Michael's knuckles were white, a desperate, foolish thought crossing his mind that violence could somehow delete the digital evidence glowing on every wall. I didn't flinch because I knew that James had already moved 3 steps ahead, his own hand steady on the switch that would end the charade for good. The threat of losing their wealth was nothing compared to the look of absolute, icy disappointment that had settled into the lines of my husband's face. Michael's arm tensed as he prepared to swing the mallet at the main server, but a new window snapped open on the center screen, a live feed of a waiting room that made the tool slip from his numb fingers. He recognized the 2 men in dark suits sitting there, and the realization of exactly who Robert had called finally broke the last of his defiance. The mallet hit the floor with a hollow, pathetic thud that sounded like the final gavel in a trial Michael had already lost. His face didn't just pale, it seemed to dissolve, the lines of his youthful arrogance collapsing into a map of pure, unadulterated terror as he stared at the federal agents on the screen. On the monitor, the 2 men in suits were checking their watches with the clinical patience of people who know that the exit is already blocked. James tried to stand up with a look of ultimate, icy authority, but he'd forgotten he was still wearing his indoor slippers, the ones with the rubber grips that made a series of cheerful, suctioning pop sounds against the polished floor. He froze for a second, staring at his feet with the intense betrayal one usually reserves for a broken promise, then continued his stride as if he'd intended for the floor to applaud his every step. I've spent my life watching people think they can outrun the consequences of their own choices, never expecting the finish line to be their parents' garage. Patricia was weeping now, but it wasn't the tears of a daughter seeking a father's forgiveness. It was the frantic sobbing of a cornered investor watching the market crash in real time. John was actually glancing at the ceiling vents, probably wondering if he could fit his ego through the ductwork, a thought as delusional as his belief that he could ever outnegotiate me. I reached out and straightened Michael's collar, a motherly habit from his school days that now felt like a cold, final benediction before a storm. "You always did have trouble with the fine print, Michael," I said, my voice echoing in the sterile silence of the command center. "You thought we were the past, a couple of relics to be filed away in a smaller house, while we were busy archiving every mistake you ever made." James finally managed to turn off his pink glowing mug, though he did it with a jab so forceful I thought he might actually crack the ceramic. He looked at the clock, letting the silence stretch until it was a physical weight pushing our children toward their knees. They weren't fighting anymore. They were sinking, realizing that the only thing standing between them and the handcuffs on that screen was the mercy of the two people they had tried to erase. Robert leaned forward, his finger hovering over the transmit button that would send every forged document directly to the agent's tablets. I caught James's eye, and for a heartbeat, the decision to either save them or let them burn hung in the air like a held breath. The blue light of the servers bathed the room in a cold, artificial dawn that made the tears on Patricia's face look like static on a dead screen. James reached for the end call button on the terminal, but his finger, stiff from a morning spent in a chilly garage, accidentally swiped the volume up icon instead. A sudden, thunderous burst of jazz music from Robert's playlist filled the space, a cheerful saxophone solo that felt like a surreal punchline to the wreckage of our family's trust. James stared at the speakers with a look of profound, silent indignation, his jaw set as he eventually found the right control and plunged us back into a silence that felt heavier than the music. "I believe the term your generation uses is game over, Michael," James said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the very marrow in my son's bones. I walked over to the workbench and picked up the for sale sign Patricia had dropped. It felt light, flimsy, and utterly insignificant compared to the 40 years we had spent building this life. I didn't rip it or throw it. I simply handed it back to her, my touch lingering on her hand just long enough for her to feel the coldness of my resolve. We had decided, in a silent exchange of glances, that we wouldn't send them to the men in the suits today, but we wouldn't be paying their way ever again. Their allowances, their equity, their easy access to our legacy, it was all gone, evaporated into the digital ether of the servers Robert had helped us build. John looked like a man who had been told the air was no longer free, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound emerging. Michael didn't look at us as he turned toward the heavy steel shutters, his posture finally reflecting the smallness of the man he had become. I watched them walk out into the afternoon sun, 3 figures shrinking in the distance of the driveway we had paid for with our sweat and our silence. James put his hand on my shoulder, his grip as steady as the foundation of the house he had built with his own 2 hands. We sat down in the quiet of our fortress, 2 people who had seen the worst of our own blood and decided to remain standing anyway. They didn't break us. They only reminded us that we are the ones who hold the keys to the future they thought they could steal.